Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. In the previous video, we introduced the whole concept of a global state. Okay, and then usually when you have like a global state, like when you use something like React or whatnot, there oftentimes like you're thinking of a state management library like an NGRX or a Redux. But Redux adds this extra sort of abstraction to it, where basically instead of just updating a global state, you have this thing called your function called a reducer that can do stuff with your state before it returns the final state to be updated. So I have that functionality built into this library, but instead of it just being part of the global store, it's attached to you can do it locally or globally. So let's kind of walk through how you would use the reducer. So there's always two pieces. So if you ever use Redux, there's two pieces. There's your reducer, that's the function that runs, and then dispatch, which makes the call to that function. Okay, the dispatch is already built into the component. You have to define the reducer. Okay, so we'll go back here, and again, this is just another piece you can define before you start defining your components. So we'll say this is my test reducer, const test reducer. Okay, and just kind of like in the way a reducer works, just kind of like in Redux, it takes the old state, so it takes whatever the state currently is as an argument, but it also takes something else, which is referred to as the payload. Typically, the payload is an object, but you can decide what it is. It's whatever you decide to put into the function. You'll see what I mean. Okay. Then, basically, you can do whatever you want in this function. Whatever gets returned at the end, though, is your new state. So usually the way it's done is people will have a property to their payload. So their payload will be an object that has a property called action. This is just sort of the standard way it's done. So what happens is you do something like a switch payload dot action. Okay, and then you would then have your switch statement built up there. So I'm just going to have one case. So case goodbye. Okay, and if it's goodbye, then you're going to return an object where now hello, the hello property says goodbye. Okay, and then of course you always want to have a default case, and the default case, okay, usually in this case you're just going to return, meaning it doesn't match one of the intended actions that you wanted. And then you would just do return the old state, so the state doesn't change. Okay, so that's essentially the standard sort of way you would use it, but you could literally do anything you want. Again, all that matters is that you return something at the end to be your new state. But you can, whatever you can dream can happen. So that's that. So now, if we're just talking about a single component, so we're going to work with the local state, I can pass that reducer after initial state. So in this case, I'd pass test reducer here. And on my class component, I could just pass it after initial state as well. Test reducer. Okay, test reducer. And now both of them have access to it. So let's practice using it locally first. So let's go back to our index.html here. Now what we're going to do is change our function. So we're going to use the test1, the first component. Test1 dot set, not set state now, that's dispatch. Okay, dot dispatch, and then basically all you have to do is pass in a payload. So again, the payload usually is an object, and again usually has a property called action plus properties for anything else you want to pass in. But the action usually is some sort of word, so we're going to say goodbye was our, I think is what we used. So yep, goodbye. So the action is goodbye, and that tells the reducer what to do with the old state to make it the new state. So usually the example you use is like the original state has like a property that's like 1, and then you'll have different like actions that are like add, subtract, and then depending on which one it is, it'll add or subtract from that state. Whatever. You guys get the idea. Okay? So you can create a lot of functionality for the so you can not just for state management, but this could also just be a fun way to kind of help build a lot of your functionality for your component. Cool. So that does that. So now let's test it out. So technically, now if I refresh this, Again, they both start out with hello you. But now when I click this, should only change the first one because we're only using the first one's dispatch. Okay. But there's also a global state, which I can use as well. In that case, I don't have to do anything extra. They're already previously registered with the global state when we did the G register thing. Okay, so any changes to the global state will affect those components. So let's go back to the HTML here. I don't need this one, so let's close that one. So now let's change it to, again, MercedElement. And if I remember correctly, this should be G dispatch. All the global stuff has a G in front of it. So G dispatch. And then you just pass in, but you have to pass in, I think it's the reducer, so that would be test reducer. And then the payload. Because it doesn't have a static reducer like the individual component. So you could actually change which reducer you're using on the fly, which is nice. So if you can have multiple reducers for multiple situations when you're working with your global state. But you always pass in the reducer and the payload, and then it does the exact same thing. So let's give that a shot, except now it'll change both of them because it's changing the global state. Goodbye! Haha! So that's very cool. So that's how you can use the reducer. Okay? So again, always at minimum, you need, a name and a builder function and initial state. But again, you can also add a reducer when you're building your components. Okay, in our next lesson, we'll start learning about the equivalent of lifecycle functions.